All right, we are recording, so I think we'll get things underway. Welcome, everyone. I'm Noah Cohan, Assistant Director of American Culture Studies here at WashU, and currently serving as Interim Director as well until Paige McGinley takes the helm on July 1st. We're so excited to have Paige be in the leadership role for our program. She's an Associate Professor in the Performing Arts Department here at WashU and has taught for our program many times, and we're so excited that her vision and leadership will take charge coming up in the next academic year. But for tonight, we're excited to kick off our lineup of Americanist Dinner Forums for spring 2022 with Work After the Future, organized by AMCS affiliate Heather Berg. In a couple of minutes, I'll tell you all about Heather and our other panelists, but first, I wanted to briefly tell you about our next ADF, which is coming up on March 8th. And to do so, I'm going to share a slide. Here it is. Okay, so on March 8th, which is a Tuesday from 7 to 8 p.m. Central, we'll have a Zoom discussion about The Neutral Ground, a documentary by C.J. Hunt, the director of the film. He will be with us in conversation with Sue Mobley, Director of Research for the Monument Lab, an expert on the monument removal movement and commemoration and reconciliation movements, as well as a couple of folks from WashU, Jeff Ward, Director of the WashU and Slavery Project, and Rebecca Dudley, a PhD candidate in anthropology and Harvey Fellow in American Culture Studies. Rebecca deserves credit for getting this all going. She is the spark that got this event together. So we're really excited for that conversation coming up next month on March 8th. The film, we will encourage folks to view it in advance of the event. So when you register for it, and that email will be forthcoming here in a week or two, we will send you a link to view the film so you've seen it and are prepared to discuss it at the event. So that's our next ADF. But back to tonight's event. Work After the Future and our panelists. So we have with us tonight, we are honored to be joined by Kalindi Vora, Visiting Professor of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies and of Ethnicity, Race and Migration at Yale University, with secondary appointments in History of Science and Medicine and American Studies. She is Professor of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies at UC Davis, also Director of the Feminist Research Institute, an affiliate faculty of Science and Technology Studies. She is the author of Life Support, Biocapital and the New History of Outsourced Labor, which was winner of the 4S Rachel Carson Book Prize in 2018. And with Nita Atanasowski, Surrogate Humanity, Race, Robots, and the Politics of Technological Futures. Her current book project, funded by an NSF Science and Technology Studies Award, is provisionally titled Autoimmune, Chronic Conditions and Care in a Time of Uncertain Medicine. Her publications appear in journals including Current Anthropology, the South Atlantic Quarterly, Somatechnics, Ethnos, Journal of Anthropology, Postmodern Culture, Radical Philosophy, and Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, Technoscience. Welcome, Kalindi. Our next panelist is Sarah Brouillette, Professor in the Department of English at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. She is the author of Post-Colonial Writers in the Global Literary Marketplace, Literature and the Creative Economy, and UNESCO and the Fate of the Literary. Last but certainly not least, our AMCS affiliate, Heather Berg, who writes about sex, work, and social struggle. Her first book, Porn Work, which came out last year, explores workers' strategies for navigating and subverting precarity. Her writing appears in the journals Feminist Studies, Signs, South Atlantic Quarterly, and others. Heather is Assistant Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies here at Washington University in St. Louis. Welcome to you all. We're so excited for tonight's event. Heather, I will turn it over to you to get things going. After an initial period of conversation amongst our panelists, we will open it up to you, the attendees, for your questions. So please feel free to enter those in the Q&A box when they occur to you, and we will go through them at the appropriate juncture. Thanks. Heather, take it away.
Right. Thanks so much for that introduction, Noah. And thanks to Noah, Karen, and Terry for all your organizing labors and was so thrilled to have the opportunity to ask two people that I really admire so much to be in conversation with tonight. And Sarah and Kalindi, thank you so much for being here. I've learned a lot from you both about work, precarity, and refusal, and I'm excited to get into it with you today. So our points of entry today might seem quite disparate, but we're all thinking in different ways about how to talk about the fiction or not of work-life balance in this moment. And this moment in which labor scholars are lamenting more and more the ways that the public-private divide is, as Paolo Virno says, gasping for air at this time, perhaps more than others. So this is something we're going to trouble today. So today we're all interested in different ways, different entry points are thinking about what this means for work's present and its future. And we're going to think too about what demands we might make of the future and what tools we might have at our disposal for getting there. So I'm going to start us off just talking a little bit about my point of entry. I'll then pass the mic to our speakers who will do the same. We have some questions for each other, and then we're excited to be in conversation with you all in the audience. So my point of entry into today's conversation is my work on porn work and sexual labor more broadly. My book that Noah mentioned, Porn Work, is grounded in 81 interviews, fieldwork, set visits, and really just encounters with folks in the US porn industry across a range of genres. For our purposes today, I'm thinking about porn as a job that in a lot of ways anticipates the shifts scholars of straight, that is non-sex work, often lament as new crises. Very purposefully, neither of the folks that we're in conversation with today do that kind of lament, but we might talk about its politics. And so porn workers have always been gig working is one of the main conceits of my book. And I argue that their strategies for navigating precarious conditions have a lot to offer broader conversations about the crisis of work. So I'll highlight just a few things there. One is that porn workers, like other gig workers, exit traditional jobs in search of autonomy, but often find precarity on the other side. Not just precarity, but also constant work. Porn workers seek out porn not as a last resort, but as a way to refuse boring, often but not always low-waged work that consumes just too much of life. And once there, they navigate the work of constant self-making and self-marketing. One interlocutor in the book, the performer Stoya, said, "I'm almost always working, but it's almost always really fun," which of course I think many of us as academics in this space can identify with the double bind that presents. And so porn workers also talk about how pleasure makes work livable, but also gets us to do more of it. Sarah writes about how creative work, for this very reason, comes to be a model for hyper-exploitable labor under late capitalism. And my book is in conversation with that moment too. Porn work is just one place where we see this trend and where the work is unbenefited, unprotected, and really, again, boundless. But it's also one place where porn workers are better off than many straight workers, is in their access to the means of production, to the possibility of cutting out the middleman and distributing to fans directly. So it's one of the many areas in which I think porn workers' strategies might be instructive to the rest of us, but that also press against this kind of promise of work-life balance. Another piece that I just want to highlight is the ways that the authenticity we seek in sex and in work can be sold off for parts, but can also be sustaining. And so in the industry, we see all of these ways that creativity, friendship, and desire all matter as really material conditions of work, but also things that employers strip for cynical use. And I want to think about that not as a gotcha, and I think that gotcha sometimes appears in labor studies, but instead as a struggle we're all collectively wading through. And again, to really highlight the ways that alienated work and the boundaries that it creates isn't better. So no one in the book wanted to go back to working retail. So much of the political thrust of this then is a kind of move against nostalgia. There's no longing here for a return to the factory or to the cubicle farm. And as workers organize against state surveillance at the same time as they organize against state neglect, their demands differ from some of the usual demands of the labor left. So we might think about debates over California's Prop 22, which would have designated Uber drivers independent contractors. And so much of the thrust of movement against that was to reclassify gig workers as employees. And this is something that porn workers absolutely reject, since many of them enter into the industry with hopes to avoid work rather than to further solidify their place in it. This is something we might pick up. There's also in porn's recent history no yearning for a return to the set and the boundedness that makes possible. So I think it's a community very much against the technophobia that shapes a lot of labor left conversations about platformization. And I'll just ask y'all to turn for a really beautiful deep dive into tech and the longue durée of precarity to Precarity Lab's Techno Precarious text, which is a project that Kalindi is also a part of. So I want to just think today really broadly about demands beyond the classic 8 hours for what we will and the contemporary demand for work-life balance. Instead, as one of the book's interlocutors put it, we might engage with a demand for fuck jobs in entirety. So I'll leave there and we'll come back together for some collective conversation in a bit. Kalindi, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for that wonderful overview of your research. And thank you to everyone who made this conversation possible tonight for inviting me, and also to all of you who are here with us. So I'll just give a quick overview of some of the sites of labor that I've engaged in the last couple of books I've done. So my first book, Life Support, is about outsourced work from the US in India, and that started in the 90s and went through the early 2000s, and actually in some ways is still going on. And I studied several sites of labor. So I did field work with programmers in Bangalore, India in 2005 and 6, and then later with participants in a gestational surrogacy clinic in northern India in 2008, a couple years later. So the programmer's work was mainly what I would call support coding, or specifically cleaning and debugging code for software companies in the US and Europe. And this was, again, remember, like 2005-ish, and they had a lot to say already about what it meant to do this kind of digital maintenance work. And I'm taking that term maintenance work from Salvador Zarate's work on landscaping and gardening labor in California. And he describes maintenance work as a kind of racialized, largely invisible kind of work that's actually creative, but the value of that kind of aesthetics and creativity gets accumulated by the consumers whose lives become more valuable. And so already in 2005, we're seeing that happening in outsourcing. And this digital maintenance work for my interlocutors was this necessary coding kind of grunt work, or cranking code as they called it. And it was necessary to make software products work at all, but the products were conceptualized and designed for the needs of societies other than the one that they were living in, right, than their own. And so many people said that what they actually wished for was to be able to create products that would serve the needs of the people around them, their own society. So there was a kind of alienation there. And then the book looks at those experiences alongside the many college graduates who in India at the same time are getting hired into customer service call centers in the early 2000s. And part of that work was performing cultural fluency in the worlds of their customers. So call center agents had to work to hide their non-US location and identity by studying US pop culture, accents, by performing kind of false identity for customers, all the while fielding these and harsh customer affects that were really, in truth, should have been directed at companies, but really hit the agents full force. And so this kind of self-erasure and service to a distant population meant that these kind of digital service positions were like the non-digital ones performed by Indian workers historically as colonized people. So there was a kind of interiority and subjective retooling that people had to go through to be able to even perform this kind of work. And of course, that challenges labor theories of value, among other things. So the final site for that book, which is also its own separate study, was at a transnational gestational surrogacy clinic. And surrogacy as paid work, of course, deepens this troubling of work as a category that is distinguished from the rest of life activity. And, particularly in terms of how in contracted surrogacy, the body and the selves are subjugated to this kind of contractual effort, we could call it, but also in terms of one's own sense of being at a distance, again, from the society that you're literally physically reproducing, right? Biologically reproducing. So women who became surrogates have shared really important theorizations of what their effort means. And I'm saying effort instead of work. And at least in my study, this effort didn't line up with work in the sense of employment, but rather something beyond what was could be compensated by a typical wage. So after completing life support and that surrogacy study, I realized that surrogacy actually functioned as a more general form of social relation that included, but was not limited to, gestational surrogacy. So I started seeing it as a more expansive social relationship where this idea of surrogate could indicate any kind of subject that supplements another subject or society. So I explored this in the second book with Neda Tanasowski called Surrogate Humanity. So this surrogate relationship, we argue, can be found everywhere from colonial indenture and slavery to contemporary programming of interactive social technologies. And from the vantage point of this kind of longer history of the capture of reproductive lives and labor that I see in the colonial period, the capture of those lives and labor in service of capitalist accumulation, we start to see that autonomy itself, right, this characteristic of a liberal subject, is a ruse. And in fact, that subject, that autonomy, depends completely on invisibilized and self-reproducing sort of hands that serve. So without human and increasingly technological surrogates, we can see that the liberal subject can't exist in the same way. And so that actually started to become apparent through the central role played by technology in each of these sites of labor. So that's the story of how we got to some of the sites in Surrogate Humanity, which include gig economy work like pay for task chores, like grocery shopping, housework, driving, and all the things you can hire people to do on crowdsourcing platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk. That's our primary example. So in other words, humans as a service, basically, which is how Amazon's Jeff Bezos once described Amazon Mechanical Turk. So this is the labor problem we take up in that book. So I will pause there and turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for including me in this event. It's really delightful, and it's been a great intellectual experience already to have occasion to focus on Heather's work and Kalindi's work for the last few days. And I'm excited about our discussion. So my current research in some ways picks up on work that I did in my book, Literature and the Creative Economy. And I'm trying to focus in particular on transformations in the contemporary publishing industry, very current events. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is work that I'm doing right now. And so a lot of my conclusions and frameworks are quite tentative. So I'm thinking about the transformation in the publishing industry in terms of feminization, which is by no means a new phenomenon in the publishing industry. It's something that's in some ways characteristic of it, but I would argue has been intensified in recent years. And I'm looking in particular at expanding contingent work as a fundament for publishing industry activity, and then the underlying conditions that are sort of leading to the situation are of interest also. So I'm sort of focused on 3 areas, and this started with the study of influencers, and with a case study of Caroline Calloway, just who I was interested in and fascinated by, and who's someone who, if you're not familiar, parlayed Instagram micro celebrity into a book deal, which later fell through. But and I was looking at Calloway as an example of new ways of working in publishing and new ways of being in relation to the publishing industry, where you need to prove your market value beforehand and build a career without agents and without publishers backing before you can get a book deal. And going into it with no supports is easier for someone like her with her particular identity and background. And I was interested in the performance of self as product in the case of the influencer, and thinking about this as a material foundation for narcissism. So the use of the self as a resource for promotion, for entry into the industry. And also interested in what people read for leisure. So transformations in leisure reading away from literary fiction and toward social media content. And then the second case study is of Wattpad, which is a self-publishing platform that's used by tens of millions of people, especially young women in the US. And most of the writers upload their content and they're not paid for it. And most of the users access the content for free, and the company hosts ads and uses engagement data to secure content production deals, so film, TV, and also they have a book publishing division. And I would, wager, if anyone wants to place bets, that this would be the future of publishing. Most publishing houses will be subsumed into a content production wing of like a Netflix. So I'm kind of looking at that as a model. And one of the things that interests me about Wattpad is how they exhort participation through the promise of inclusion, and how they use a language of community and inclusion in belonging, in securing use. And so they, of course, by these means get free content and the platform profits. And I'm also interested in how Wattpad authors, people who identify as authors on the platform, who've managed to get into some of the paid opportunities, understand their work or through a language of care, and how this is informing not just their self-conceptions as authors, but what they're writing. So I'm doing study of many Wattpad novels to look at the tropes around care and inclusion and community. And I think here I can refer back to something that Heather said in her remarks about something that's sustaining but exploitable. And I think that language of inclusion and belonging online has a evident appeal, especially perhaps to young women, and but is extremely vulnerable to exploitation. And then the third case study is about sensitivity readers. So these are usually the people who are hired by an author or a publisher. This is some of the lowest paid editorial work in publishing. They're gig workers who identify with a particular marginalized identity and read a manuscript and offer feedback on it. It's very emotionally taxing work, and it's also hard to cobble together enough contracts to survive on it. And publishers often won't let you promote your connection to a project. For example, they'll have a non-disclosure agreement where you can't talk about what works you worked on. So it's hard to kind of build a career in that field. And there's, kind of feared by the conservative commentariat that thinks this is like a woke mafia who are eroding free speech. But this is like wholly out of step, I think, with the way sensitivity readers are actually deliberately marginalized within the industry through a variety of means and for a variety of reasons that are interesting to me. So those are the kind of case studies of contingent work in publishing. And, I'm broadly speaking interested in shifting dispositions toward work in the industry, and Also how the language of sort of care and emotional labor and bibliotherapy attends this contingency and informality in work situations. Yeah, so that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I'm just seeing all of these resonances. I had not thought so much about the comradely connections between the sensitivity reader and the call center worker, but there's so much there in your comments. So one question just to get us started is where you're thinking about the hoped for or not boundary between life and work. Do you see this as something that we should fight to restore? And as I talk about like the language of restoration, I'm also thinking about how Kalindi in your writing with Neda, you've talked about the vision of white loss that structures political nostalgia for a before. So I use the term restoration with that in mind. But wondering how y'all are thinking about that, and if so, what that process would look like for the workers at the heart of your story to really disentangle the self and the work self.
Sarah, do you want to go first, or would you like me?
Just spent a day of this in classroom, so.
Kalindi, go ahead.
Well, I mean, maybe a bit predictably, I want to go back to the nostalgic past and just say that, you know, Neda and I are not the only ones who are deeply suspicious about the kind of class and racial formation around the idea that that past was ever there for most people for us to go back to anyway. And I was thinking about J.K. Gibson Graham's work. So their first book, The Ends of Capitalism, they talk about this affect within left revolutionary politics that remains even now with all the changes in, you know, sort of the labor scene worldwide, sort of focused on this idea of some kind of global future revolution, but also realizing that it can happen. There's this cannot happen. There's this kind of melancholy for that time past when it felt like it could be possible to have this kind of proletarian revolution. And instead, J.K. Gibson Graham, in their next book, Post-Capitalist Politics, talks about, you know, how do you get around that blank focus of the left? And they suggest thinking about models of local transformation that aren't based in shared identity or shared consciousness, such as the proletariat or the worker or even a class, but instead work directly against the kind of oppression that they're facing. And then they talk about this idea of a movement of movements, which works really well for the kind of sites that I'm looking at, especially let's take surrogacy as an example. So here, you know, I'm talking about people who very self-consciously don't identify what they're doing as labor. And, you know, Amrita Pandey, who also writes about surrogacy, has talked about the efforts of feminists in India to organize surrogates as a kind of union, and why that's, you know, and it's difficult because part of the participation is the idea that this isn't a career, it's not a job, it's something you do because there aren't any other equivalent options. And, you know, my people I spoke to said they actually wouldn't want, say, their children to participate. So what does resistance then look like, or what does protest look like? And I think about Angela Davis's work on how resistance looked, for example, in the households of people who were enslaved, who were doing reproductive labor, but not even necessarily for their own chosen families, right? Just for whomever they lived with. And so in that sense, it wasn't even the kind of reproductive labor we're talking about today. And, you know, Angela Davis talks about how even in that kind of reproduction, the possibilities for protest were being produced with the reproduction of the lives of the people in those households. And so I'm going back and I'm thinking about things that surrogates said about, you know, what we really want is this kind of lifetime insurance that our families are going to be okay. You know, don't try to make this labor. Instead, let's make this about life. Like, I want, you know, health insurance. I want my kids to go to college or to, you know, get an education. So it's kind of a long way of kind of circling back to that nostalgia question and saying, well, there are models actually right now in the sites that we're looking at that are more interesting and probably more pragmatic than the sort of revolution model.
Maybe after I talk a little bit about this question, I don't know, Heather, if you have comments you'd like to make about it. I know you posed it, but you might have some thoughts. I would be curious to hear. Okay. Yeah, just, I thought a lot about this, and I think about it all the time in my work, the boundary between work and life, and how the people whose work I study, how they think about this. And, you know, speaking personally from an anti-work perspective, I need to say, you know, first that I think of work as anathema to life, and also that one person's life is another life, like in this Kalindi sense of the vital force, you know, is another person's work. And I think, you know, the idea of the boundary between work and life is hard for so many reasons. How do you establish what constitutes life? People who are not working a paying job are still doing so much non-working work to support people who are, or to support aspiration, like tweeting to try to build a reputation, or playing video games on Twitch, or you know, doing the washing up to support a household of working people or school-age people who are in training for work. So when they are doing life, are they not doing work? And then, you know, I think also the reference it to a boundary, it can't help but evoke the idea of balance, work-life balance, and that's all, you know, such a deeply unsatisfying construct, and, you know, seems to arise in relation to this ideal of a kind of personal wellness, that if we could just achieve for ourselves this balance, then everything would be okay, without reference beyond our personal situation. And that this could also, you know, the idea of work-life balance, you know, it seems to, it rose in popularity at the same time as the creeping technological intrusions that made it harder and harder for people to distinguish between work and life. Obviously, that's what it responds to. So then there's a sense that, you know, you could personally achieve balance and protect that balance, and then the struggle's complete. And I think there's also the problem of idealization of a kind of healthy mindset vis-a-vis one's working life, as though someone can establish for themselves a healthy ratio. It's obviously profoundly individualizing. If my balance is premised on someone else's, you know, teetering right over. And I think too, you know, the idea of a healthy boundary seems so false in conditions of contemporary work, which render almost illegible on a practical level this idea of boundary, because people work, you know, when and how they can, and are often piecing together work in whatever way possible. And when work is so often experienced as indistinguishable from who you are, and is another thing you do on your computer in between your hobbies and your friendships. So there's just, it's so interwoven, which I know was what occasions the question, but I just find it very deeply difficult for precisely this reason. And there's a way in which what would be considered to some a sort of perverse addiction to work is just a material necessity for some people. Most people, unfortunately, need more work, not less, because, you know, their work is so badly paid and pieced together. And of course, I think as Kalindi's work very brilliantly shows, the boundary may be maintained for some, but at what cost to others. And it's usually premised upon the outsourcing of some of the work of being in the world to even more precaritized, often racialized, feminized others who take on the work of care that you pushed to the side. And yeah, so all this, I think it's always recommended to me kind of wariness about the idealization of a boundary between work and life that we can justify propping up without saying all of this first. And, you know, in the absence of social reorganization away from privation, where people compete for what they need to survive, and some get to have a healthy boundary between work and life, and others get to struggle to find enough work, you know, to even buy basic necessities. That's, you know, without that, it just seems impossible to conceive in a way, a boundary. I would say, you know, for workers, I study, at least to the extent that I know, who do contingent work in publishing, life as a kind of idealized horizon beyond work would be to create and express and communicate in conditions when there is no dependence on income for survival. But that's why I'm a communist, you know, so fuck jobs, but, you know, until then, better pay would probably be a good way to like get the boundary more on track, you know. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. Yeah, I mean, I posed the question hoping that you would destroy its very foundations. And I think that so much of what's so generative in what you're both saying is exactly the tactics and demands that get opened up when we stop making this really short range demand for balance. So I'll just say briefly, I mean, I'm thinking of so many resonances between porn workers' demands and what you're describing, Kalindi, and surrogates' demands around not labor, but life. And this came up a lot around questions of even the minutia of labor law, where trying to parse how the state might determine what kind of mainline labor scholars call the fissured workplace. So like when you get hurt on set, is your boss the director or a producer or an agent? Who should pay for injury and illness? These kinds of questions that is very easy to get stuck in the weeds with, but that become possible to totally move past. And so I'll just say, in I think this parallel with what surrogates are demanding here, then that porn workers say, like maybe the state should pay as a kind of demand that gets us past some of that boundary drawing. So that's what I'll say to that. But Kalindi, I wonder if that leads us, if we could zoom out then to the question that you had about work as such, how, and the kind of definitional work that we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, the question that I was thinking about as I reviewed both of your work, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about. I hate to just pick one, but was the way that, you know, you're both really careful in your attention to the specific kinds of work that you're describing and the experiences of the people that you're talking to about work. And so I wonder, you know, and you might have heard me kind of struggling with the word work and labor in my own presentation. You know, your work led me to think, what is actually employment or work in our current moment? And should we think of work as the means of having your needs met? Is that a definition, or is it specifically compensated effort to meeting someone else's needs in order to get paid, right? Rather than my own? Is it still equivalent to waged work? And I'm with Sarah on, you know, until we abolish work, at least we should pay people more, right? So I'm not trying to get rid of that effort, that, you know, endeavor, but I'm wondering what other kinds of concepts or descriptors you or your interlocutors came up with to explain their effort, compensated or not, and, you know, what kind of traction those terms or concepts had.
Sarah, do you want to take this, or should I start?
Sure. I don't know if I have particularly intelligent thoughts about this. This is something that I think I struggle with, and I've used different terminology at different points in my research career for talking about contemporary work. And I mean, I think of work, I think for myself, this is not something I've written down, but as materially induced activity compelled by, seeking sustenance in life. And in a way, I think my understanding of work, although not specifically about the traditional conception of wage labor, is very grounded in Marx, and is I think that I always have the image of the Vogelfrei, the person who is free but bereft, bereft of social supports, bereft of what they need to reproduce themselves and their families in life, and therefore compelled to seek employment. I think that's still the basic conception of work that is somewhere in my mind when I'm working. But I think other sort of concepts that I found useful in recent years is thinking a little bit about the breakdown of the boundaries, like we were just talking about, between work and other kinds of activities. But I think also work and what I would call, or I'm thinking about calling, please tell me not to, but workishness, which is like things that relate, they're not paid employment, even gig work, but they're related to the pursuit of that. And people use all kinds of terminology for this in the study of creative labor, like aspirational labor or hope labor. And I think those are all useful in different ways, but I've sort of just fixated on workishness in a way to complement a concept that's been floating around in literary studies for a while now, which is bookishness. And that I think workishness is what compels bookishness. But anyway, that there's that there's so much that people do that isn't directly compensated, but that is involved in the construction of their work lives. And then, of course, I'm also in line with other studies of, say, Amazon Mechanical Turk, that there's a form of work that's what Phil Jones calls subemployment, which is, where it's barely employment. There's barely a connection to an employer, certainly no form of responsibility in the contract, and you can perform the task and have it not be paid at the whim of this distant source of the activity and the action. So this is I'm kind of more interested, or I'm finding it more useful, I guess, to think about workishness and subemployment as conditions of contemporary work, rather than theorizing creative labor, which is what I was doing in that other book and project. Not that it's useless, but that my thought has shifted somewhat.
I'll be quick here. And I'll say, I think for me, it's been important to define work outside of payment. And this is, so to define it as activity that generates profit for capital, since so much work is unwaged. And so also then not meeting this other criteria that Kalindi's question offers up around whether it's compensated effort. And this is something that's all really contested by the porn workers in my book who struggle over whether to call what they're doing work for all sorts of reasons. One of them is because so many people disidentify with work because they see it as misery dealing and they want their sexual labor to mean something else. And at the same time, it is making money for capital, whether that be a producer or a platform. So I think I'll say quickly that I'm interested in talking about hustles as a frame that highlights the ways that sex workers especially, but that others in the informal economy take something from work that's beyond what racial capitalism intends. And I think that the hustle really leads us there. And for sex workers in particular, to to think about what I'm calling like against a client's eye view. So that, you know, the client might get a blowjob, but you get groceries for the week. And the capitalist state might get the reproduction of the worker, but you derive something else that's beyond what either other party perceives. And so that feels generative for me. But I'll turn it back over to you, Kalindi, if you wanted to say anything else to that, to your own point.
Well, I'm just thinking so much about what both of you are offering, and just the way that both of you have also thought about the kind of embodiment or the embodiedness of people performing these kinds of work, and the way that, you know, I'm thinking about in Sarah's work, the idea of gendered forms of self-disclosure as part of this like pre-employment, this anticipatory kind of work that has to be done. I'm thinking about a lot of the work on especially immigrant, domestic, and nannying work that's done, especially in sociology, like Raquel Pereñas's work on global chains of care, which is, you know, a situation where you have women immigrating, usually to centers of capital, taking on jobs, caring for households and children, meanwhile leaving their households and children behind, right? And then, you know, Anne Addingnos talks about how in her research, nannies, you know, immigrant women who are nannies actually pour the love that they would have into their own children, into the children that they're taking care of, as a way to kind of take care of themselves, right? To kind of comfort themselves in that loss. And just thinking about, you know, how the kind of concept of work doesn't really describe that. And in my first book, I tried working with this concept of vital energy, which was how can we use the notion of living labor from Marx to deal with all of these kinds of feminized forms of labor that Marx couldn't really conceptualize. And I was working with it because in my sites, especially in surrogacy, I was thinking about this affective and biological labor, that's labor, yes, and then so much more. But now that vital energy category, you know, it can't actually really encompass these kinds of subjective and embodied practices that we're talking about today. So, you know, it worked to some extent, but I don't work with it anymore.
I think that's a really beautiful hinge actually to Sarah's curiosity about alienation. So I wonder if I can turn it over to you, Sarah.
Sure. Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I had a question that was, I mean, in a way, I wanted to find a way to get you to talk about doing research based on in interviews, which is not something that I have done, although I use self accounts of people working all the time, and I'm in the process of setting up interviews with sensitivity readers. And I noticed that for each of you, the subjects of your research, they have narratives about their work, refusing the phrase that Kalindi uses is refusing the alienation of commercialization. And so, Heather, you argue that porn workers are drawn to the idea that they're escaping work, that this is a sort of reiterated self-narrative. And this is the story is actually important kind of mechanism for surviving when things aren't as great. And then Kalindi, in your work on surrogates, I was really struck by this argument that about that, seeing their work as extraordinary rather than only economically motivated, and that there were some sort of like, I don't know, utopian or transformative potentials in their ways of thinking about what would be a better situation after their work is completed. And so, yeah, I thought I would like to hear you both talk a bit about why studying the affective experience of work is important to you, because, that's something that I think is distinct in your work, and it's not the maybe even the dominant strain in contemporary conceptions of work to focus on worker self-conceptions understanding. And also then I had a kind of like, if it's not too boring, academic methodological question, because I'm interested in methodologies for studying work. If you see yourself as intentionally sort of devising a methodology that connects academic research to lived experience of workers.
Kalindi, do you want to lead or shall I?
Either, why don't you?
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for this question, Sarah. I suppose that, yeah, both of the moves that we're trying to make, they don't go without saying. And I think for me, what I love about ethnography and interview-based work is the ways that it forces you to confront, I think, some taken for granted assumptions, in this case around theories of creative labor, for me particularly. So, but there's a way that we could each tell these stories about surrogates understanding their labor not as labor, and around porn workers as disidentifying with work as stories of false consciousness, or in the porn work context. Of course, I think the common left read is that this is a kind of neoliberal entrepreneurship that just traps people in cycles of more work. And I think, had I been reading, I forget the terms that you use, but like workers' own narratives about themselves just on paper, I think I might have erred that way. But there's something about the intimacy of being in conversation with people in the spaces that they've invited you into that makes that impossible. And for me, that absolutely upended so much of what I came to initially in writing the book. And so in particular, this question of what I wanted to do originally, which was make a case for porn as work. And what I ended up doing was taking people seriously when they disidentify with that. So all that's to say, yeah, I do think it's all about method, and I'm indebted to the method for its capacity there. To this latter part of the question around whether I see myself as intentionally devising a method that connects academic research to lived experience, I think absolutely. I think throughout the book, the theoretical moves I'm trying to make are to force academic theorization, like to force a confrontation there with what porn workers are saying on the ground, and to say that in these moments that that confrontation yields conflict, that theory has to answer to what people are saying on the ground. So I guess, back to this common claim that we should be trying to resuscitate a boundary between life and work. Many porn workers, particularly people who perform as straight women, are saying, like, the thing we should be moving back to is absolutely not unpaid sex, for example. So that's just one moment in which that becomes true for me.
Just thinking, I'm appreciating so much, Heather, when you said that one of the things you love about interviewing is basically just getting the opportunity to take people at their word, even when it undoes what you think you know. And I feel the same way about interviewing and ethnography in general. I was in an interesting kind of dilemma in my first book project, which is that I wanted to do ethnography for those very reasons. I think being as you say, in places where you've been invited to kind of have this intimacy while conversing with people on their terms, often, hopefully, and the privilege of representing other people's narratives about their experience, but also in my case, really trying to think about what this really affective and subjective kind of effort or work, if we want to call it, is like. And people can't always narrate that, right? And I can't pretend to know something they don't tell me. That's the other side of ethnography, or the interview method. And so I actually spent probably 18 months just trying to think about the right method both ethically and just in terms of fair representation for that first book, Life Support. And I write about it extensively in the book because I think that the aesthetic representation of experience really does serve an important purpose in that book, which is all the aesthetic texts I use in that book are written by or created by people, for the most part, who have had the work experiences that I'm talking about. And so there's a way in which that sort of concentrated representation of experience does something that interviews can't always, which is represent the interiority of impact or experience. And, you know, maybe if you're lucky, your interviewees can do that. But so for me, that was a really critical component of the methodology for that book, which is why do you need both to talk to people and also to read literature? Yeah.
Thank you all so much for this really generative and exciting conversation. I've learned a lot, and I know a lot of our other attendees have as well. We have a couple of questions that I'd like to get to, and if there are others out there chewing on questions, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A or the chat, I suppose, if you so choose. I'm going to start with a question from Anka Parvalescu. Hi, Anka. I believe Kalindi touched on a little bit of this, but I'll pose it to you all and see if we can expand some more. Anka writes, Sarah mentioned the feminization of labor in the cases she studies. How do the panelists think about the feminization of work in relation to the feminist materialist category of women's work? How about the related effective work?
Anyone? Sarah, you unmute.
Yes. It's like the opposite of Jeopardy, you know, where you want to bring in first, you want to, but since I mentioned in the question, thank you, Anka. It's a really great question. It's just such a huge question. The materialist feminist category of women's work is very important to how I'm thinking about the feminization of work in publishing. So part of what I'm trying to do is historicize the claim that women are taking over publishing by looking at how and when that started to happen. And the comparison that I'm using is to the history of librarianship, which is an area of work that women entered into when women entered into the workforce. And I'm talking about in Canada and in the US and in the UK. And the overlap with the category of women's work is interesting. There's a way in which librarianship was, I won't go into like every detail of this, but that it was, you know, deemed suitable work for women because it resembled work they were already doing in the home around like ideally cultural guidance for their children and sort of being like stewards of their children's education. And so it was seen as sort of like appropriate employment. And when women started to work in libraries, they were paid, you know, half basically of what men were paid, with no attempt. There was no need to justify this. It was seen as perfectly fitting, and that they would be doing the work in part out of a desire to serve the community, and that would compensate for, and this is in, you know, the late 19th, early 20th century, that would compensate for the halved pay. And something, so I make a parallel between this and then when women started to become the dominant
Like Sarah's frozen. Maybe we can return to Sarah's screen. Kalindi, do you want to hop in next or shall I?
Yeah, sure. Oh, she's back.
Oh,
yeah, hold on a sec. Am I unstable here? Can you see me now?
now
Yeah,
you're good. Yeah.
No, we lost you for a second.
Yeah, so, and then, so if I move more up to the present, I'm again looking at or considering the category of women's work and also effective labor, because I'm looking at the way in which the increase, the spreading sort of contingency as a fundamental sort of feature of publishing industry employment and a foundation for the industry's profits, it tends to be accompanied precisely by this language of emotion and care and bibliotherapy, which we all probably associate to some extent with publishing now, at least sort of mainstream publishing, that reading books, provides you with a form of care, and that it's a form of self-care, and all this sort of language. So yeah, all of these categories and theoretical considerations are, and the sort of the history of Marxist feminist thought about the family and women's role in the home and work appropriate to women. It's all kind of percolating, I guess, right now as I devise, my overall project.
Yeah, and I'll try to be really brief because I feel like I could talk forever on this topic. Several feminist materialists have really influenced my thinking, and I bring them together with Black feminism and women of color feminism as approaches to thinking about histories of labor, because I also don't think that they've got the whole angle on women's work, so-called women's work. So I'll just say, in terms of the technology work that I haven't gotten to talk about that much, actually, Maria Mee's work in patriarchy and accumulation of capital was really helpful. She actually, and it makes me think about both of your work as well. She talks about how the marriage contract was basically both what made the nuclear family possible, but also it created this new kind of economic form where instead of a labor contract, you have a contract of, it is a labor contract, but instead of a wage, you get love. And this kind of love is a new historical invention, right? It's this romantic love that didn't exist before. And so love is compensation for labor, not a wage. And then that marriage contract, Mee says, sets up this model for unpaid labor in the private sphere in general, setting us up for this kind of casualization, right? With the gig economy, crowdsourcing. But also is extended through globalization to encompass those formerly colonized labor economies. So service labor also kind of falls into that new, or that not anymore new, but that sort of constructed category. And so in some ways, the feminist materialists really were the first ones to predict, and Sylvia Federici in particular, that reproduction was actually maybe more important than productive labor, right? That reproductive labor. So yeah, and I think that definitely, their affective labor fits in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll also be brief. I know we've got other questions, but I think I'll just come into this by route of talking about, I mean, on the one hand, like all of the contingencies that porn workers confront are related to sex work as a feminized labor, regardless of the gender of those doing the work. But one thing that was really striking to me in terms of Anka, this piece of your question around affective work, was how cis men performers talk about their affective labor on different terms. And in particular, the affective work of feigning pleasure is something that cis men who have sex with women have such little frame of reference for faking it and outside of their work lives. And so I became just really interested in that dynamic where the most feminized aspect of the work for cis men who work in straight scenes is imagining like other oriented sex in that kind of way. Whereas for straight cis women, this was really the standard for thinking about sex performed or otherwise. So that's just one kind of set of tensions around that question.
Thank you all for those lovely answers. Our next question is from Liam Kruger. He writes, not to make this about the academy, but would scholarly publishing research fall under workishness? Like, it is necessary, not sufficient for getting and keeping gigs in the academy, OTOH, wholly unremunerated. On the other hand, it does partially help universities maintain research institution tax exemptions.
I think that's a Sarah question.
I'm just going to say yes.
All right, great. Our next question, I'll go to the next question in the chat. Chia Lien, they write, how do you imagine social movement, both short-term and long-term, in the era of the gig economy? It seems to me there is no concrete enemy. Consumers, employers, state, self, capitalism, and a very divergent work entrance, voluntary for sex workers, involuntary for many others. Does resistance necessarily become individualized fights to the individualized enemy?
I'll volunteer myself to start off this one. I love this question. I think, it's something I think a lot about because, again, a primary assumption on the part of the civilian or non-sex worker left is that sex workers are individualized, lack collectivity, particularly those who disidentify with worker status. And so I'm really interested in all of the ways that resistance in a gigified scene is absolutely collective, but just not in the terms of collective bargaining and traditional trade unionism, which is a real problem for much of the labor left. And it's that stickiness that I always want to kind of push against. So most porn workers would rather have no boss than one disciplined by collective bargaining. And that's a crisis for conventional understandings of what struggle and social movement should look like here. But there's also all sorts of collectivity at work. And just one example of that I'll share really briefly is what happened in the early days of the pandemic as porn workers were moving off the set. Imagine a time in which we were not forced to go to work because it was unsafe. That seems so impossible to us now, but there was this brief moment and folks were pushed away from in-person work. And even as the online market was just absolutely crushed, the kind of collective, not just mutual aid, but information sharing around how to hack online systems was just incredibly vibrant. So that's just one small example of the ways that the collectivity lives in spite of the gigified scene that I'll point to. I'll turn it over to y'all.
I'll just make a quick comment since two of the things you said, Heather, really resonate with examples I've seen. The idea of you can have collectivity that does political work without necessarily being organized as a collective struggle against something. And also the idea of information sharing is really important, especially in online work. So you may know Lily Irani and Six Silverman started this project called Turkopticon, which is for Amazon Mechanical Turk workers who can't, that platform is organized so that employers can see everything about the people they employ to do tasks, but the task workers actually can see very little about employers. So, it may be an employer who's going to cheat them or underdescribes the labor involved, and so therefore they get underpaid. So Six Silverman and Lily Irani created this tool that anyone can download, and the tool allows workers to put in information about employers. So it's information sharing, and it's actually you can have it in your browser when you're on the platform, and you can see information about the employers. And so it's not, it is organized against the platform, but not necessarily against specific employers. But I also wanted to add that I do still think that capitalism is a shared, I don't know if enemy is the right word, but target of anti-oppression efforts.
Sarah, did you want to add anything on that?
Sure, if that's okay. And yeah, I agree. And, I think the thing I want to say about this question is something that I said in my introductory remarks, sort of, which is that there's a value in struggle that doesn't take place within the traditional workplace, and that is actually in fact struggle against the workplace, and it doesn't want to return to the site of work as the site of collectivity, and wants to find other forms of commonality and identification. And I have a couple thoughts about collective sites of struggle within publishing. And one thing that I think is really important that is going on, and that I've noticed is sort of proliferating in recent years, is struggle over the nature of one's incorporation or inclusion in the mainstream publishing industry. So just for instance, recently some racialized writers refused to do any more work for the Wattpad platform, and they withdrew from its paid programming because it privileges and prefers white writers. And, you know, these writers who withdrew, they're objecting to the terms of inclusion. You know, they're not objecting to the basic structure of the whole company, which is this profoundly platform capitalist thing. But nevertheless, I think there's something very important about their exit. And thinking about it in relation to the Caroline Calloway example, you see how in a situation where you're expected to work for free for some time and do all this work of curating your brand and so on, certain people, white, pretty, ableized, from wealth, are already at an advantage for success. So there's a way in which something that appears to be, you know, not sufficiently anti-capitalist or about your own, you know, self-betterment, fighting the racialized terms of inclusion, it actually does reveal the whole undercurrent of insidious competition, you know, and extraction of often free work from people who have uneven access to supports for success, you know, and all of the things that sort of attend the background and career trajectory of usually successful publishing industry executives. And then, like, very tentatively, and again, like, definitely disagree, but you know, I do find myself still like attracted to the EndNote's research collective idea of unity and separation, and also think that there's a collectivity in depressive affects. And I feel like just, you know, the sheer proliferation of expression of despair and anxiety and multiplying mental health care crises and addictive behavior and weariness and exhaustion and disaffection from work. This is something akin to, you know, a creative gig workers strike. Obviously, I don't mean a strike in the traditional sense. So please, communist theory bros, don't at me. But there's something in that, and I don't, you know, have the precise way in which I'd want to formulate this, but I feel like the revelation of sort of the emotional consequences of the pace of work, the constancy of the work, the instability, and just having to always navigate as part of your career building the horribly addictive and often unnerving, pain-inducing world of social media and the dependence on that. So I think like there's something there that is also worth talking about as like you know, not a site of struggle, but a site of revelation of the need of struggle or something like that.
Thank you. Our next question is from Loris McCoy-Greason. Loris writes, "This is really such a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for sharing with us tonight. I'm curious if any of you have come across and or work with the concept posed by Lee-Claire Laberge in relation to socially engaged art, decommodified labor. She uses it to speak to the proliferation of non-paid work in the arts, but also writ large. A lot of crossover clearly with your own work and the topics touched on tonight. I'm asking in relation to the question discussed earlier on terminology, since it seems like there's some overlap between some of the terms mentioned, and I'm curious whether Laberge's work has resonated with any of you."
Sarah, have y'all published together? Am I making that up? You've not, okay.
Well, we've been included in the same collections.
Got it. Okay. I'm just like, I'm seeing your names next to one another. I'll just say yes, absolutely, to this question of whether I see resonances there. And I especially am taken by Laberge's like refusal to engage in the conversation around decommodification through the lens of condescension around what artwork means for people. So that's all I'll say about that.
I know Leclerc quite well, and yes, I mean, I would want to carefully formulate my relationship to the idea of decommodified labor. I don't feel like alert enough or prepared enough at this moment, but I consider myself in conversation with Leclerc's work and admire her scholarship.
Well, we have a few minutes left. If anyone out there still with us, thank you for staying on. If anyone has a final question, now is your chance. Looks like one just popped up. From Ignacio Sanchez Prado, Nacho. Hi, Nacho. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations and comments. If there is time, I wonder if we can expand this to a transnational scope. I was thinking, for example, of the case of the cookbooks that had to delay pub dates because they are sitting in the bottom of the ocean after the loss of a container. He adds, this implies labor networks, right? Any transnational thoughts or comments?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Maybe it's this, can we expand this to a transnational scope? To me, it sounds like the question is about supply chain in relationship to all the labor shortages that are happening right now, but I'm not 100% sure. Maybe they don't mind clarifying. So virtual sex work crosses borders. Okay. Well, I mean, I'll just go back to some of the comments I've made about outsourcing. I think that it's quite without getting into the, too many details, we can think about Heather's work on how part of the kind of casualized labor that people turn to online rather than going into formal workplaces is for a certain kind of feeling of entrepreneurship or freedom or creative force, but also means that those people are not protected. And this, again, I'm thinking about your work, Heather, by conventional labor protections. And you mentioned Prop 22, which would have protected driving workers in California, right, as employees and given them employee entitlements. But that's always been a problem for cross-border labor. And it's actually always seduced corporations into outsourcing their work. It is actually the drive for outsourcing and offshoring as well. And I can't really speak to the specifics of the current supply chain issues that are connected to labor, because I think it's actually different in each nation that we're talking about. But I do think that very much this issue of what counts as the sort of creative, high value labor and what is the necessary but often invisible labor that makes that work possible is a question of borders. And the borders actually function as a technology. And I'm thinking about Yvonne Char Lopez's work on the border as technology, a technology that actually allows for a kind of control of labor, devaluing on one side and valuing on the other.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say really, really briefly then to volley it back to your work, Kalindi. I think I think a lot in conversations around the demands we make of labor law about the kind of, this is the longue durée that your work like constantly returns us to. of precarity and of the ways that these protections have failed even those within the borders historically. And so in that sense, I guess, Nacho, to your question, I just think about the ways that sex work has always been undocumented work for sex workers as contingent workers. And so some of the, and I suppose to Cha's question too about individualized fights, but also that solidarity, some of the ways that the demands in both cases and where they overlap have to return to demands that cross borders because the flows do.
Sarah, did you want to add any?
Not really. It's such a huge question. Sorry, Nacho. I have thoughts about it, but they're just, you know, I think it's an interesting thing. I mean, the mention of cookbooks, I think it's a question that implies that there's a lot more room in study of the publishing industry to study the entire supply chain, which is something that I've said a million times. You know, I heartily agree that there is a real inattention to the actual manufacture of books as products and the kind of work that goes into that, and a tendency to focus more on what I do focus on, which is authorship, editorial, publishing, agency system, this kind of stuff. And there are transnational dimensions even to the work in publishing that I study that kind of like, again, dictate, determine, or to some extent constrain access to what I'm calling success supports, but that if you are born in a particular place, namely London or New York, you're going to have a much easier time of sort of navigating the world of publishing than if you're, this is like obviously extremely sweeping statement, but I just mean to indicate that there is a transnational fundament here where, even though at the same time, a lot of the work that I'm talking about is done in a way that would seem to be border transcendent, you know, because it's all digital files and the work is done at all different hours of the day in order to accommodate clients from all over the world, you know, this kind of stuff. But it is relevant. It's just a huge question that I haven't like consciously focused on in my own research, even though I do study publishing industries in various national locations.
Well, I have never been more conscious of the labor that goes into one of these events. So thank you all for sharing that labor with us tonight. Really was enlightening for me personally, and I hope for our audience members as well. So thank you all for coming. As I said off the top, our next Americanist Dinner Forum will be on Zoom on March 8th. More details forthcoming about that. But we hope you enjoyed tonight's event, and I hope you all have a great evening. Thanks.